Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to our evening Dhamma question and answer period. Not sure what's happening with the audio. We're still getting... So we had one session where the audio was fine, and then another session where the audio sound was very deep and slow, and it wasn't on purpose. For those people who thought we're playing with special effects, we certainly are not playing with special effects here. I'm not at all concerned about whether my voice is deep or shallow. We only have 7 questions tonight, so it's a good sign. It's a sign that people's questions have all been answered and everyone is swiftly progressing towards enlightenment, perhaps. So anyway, without further ado, we will start. We'll start on these. I understand that we are to note emotions such as anger or annoyance and to try not to make positive or negative judgments about these emotions. That seems accurate. Are we trying to develop a constant state of apathy? If not, how do we live properly without becoming apathetic? So this worry of, I'm going to lose my emotions. If I meditate too much, I'll become emotionless. And that's a problem because I love my girlfriend. Now there's Lumpur Chodok tells this story of a Westerner who came to practice with him and said this. He said, I think I'm going to let go of everything, and I don't want that because I love my girlfriend. And his response was, don't worry about it, you've got lots of defilements left to cut off. But more to the point, there are ways to condition your mind, of course, and there are ways you could train yourself to become apathetic. Whatever that means, I understand apathetic. And again, we have to be very technical. We can't just throw words out. We have to define things very precisely. But I assume it means having no emotions. So we come to a state where we have no emotions, where there is no liking or disliking. From a Buddhist perspective, we would say it like that. Simply to answer your question, no, we're not aiming for that. But we're aiming to understand our minds and acquire the change or become changed as a result of having understood our minds. You see, there are emotions in the mind that are causing us suffering. They're causing other people suffering. And it's those emotions that once you see them clearly, they will never come back. I mean, over time, once you see them clearly enough. And furthermore, understand the senselessness of them, the senselessness of getting caught up and obsessed with things that are impermanent, unsatisfying, uncontrollable. And you let go. Your mind lets go and finds a higher freedom that is of complete peace, and as a result is no longer interested in these things. So there are other emotions like compassion or kindness, friendliness. Even joy doesn't ever disappear. Certain kinds of joy, because there are joys that are associated with lust or greed or desire, which are problematic. And you'll see that. So if you're worried about losing emotions, don't worry, because as long as you're still attached to your emotions, it's impossible, even if you wanted to. As I said, you could condition yourself to not feel them, but that would ever only be temporary. And that's not at all what we're aiming for. So it's important to be clear what we're aiming for is just to understand our emotions. And the results come by themselves. Once you understand things, there's no way you would do the wrong thing. Things that cause you stress and suffering. Why would you? It would be absurd to think that once you understand them fully, you would still continue them. I mean, we don't realize that there's a deeper understanding that's possible. It's not intellectual understanding, it's through clear seeing, which comes through meditation only. your picture's on. They can see you. Okay, the interface isn't working, I don't think. Buttons are not working, so I'm just going to read through these. How's YouTube doing? Is my voice okay? Can you hear? Is my voice strange sounding? Putting questions on YouTube. I make a rule not to answer them. I'd be here all night. It's not the question. So here's, what are your thoughts about the importance of an intellectual understanding of reincarnation? First of all, we don't use the word reincarnation. It's misleading. It's not accurate. In Buddhism, we just don't believe in death. Death is just a concept. The mind keeps arising and ceasing, and experience continues. I don't think it's at all really important to have much of an intellectual understanding of reincarnation. I think you should spend the time studying your mind. I mean, what we want to do is get rid of the concept that at the moment of death something magically happens to stop your mind from proliferating, from continuing on this incessant process. It makes sense if you've never investigated the mind meditatively, but once you've done it meditatively, it's how would you stop the mind from continuing to arise? How is it that the body does that? It seems absurd. But we have this strong belief because from children we're taught that the mind is the brain, and the brain has blood, and the blood is pumped by the heart, and if the heart stops, no more brain, no more mind. Or we're taught even more strange things, like then you fly up to heaven or down to hell for eternity, or so on and so on. Your soul migrates from body to body, and all these things we're taught, none of which are really accurate. So you think that somehow learning about reincarnation would give you more encouragement in the practice. Yeah, perhaps, but it's not really accurate. What should give you encouragement is the fact that you're stuck with the consequences of your actions. Death is just meaningless, really. I mean, in the large scheme of things, it's meaningful in a sense. At that moment, it's quite meaningful because the next moment is going to be quite different. But it's still just another moment and more experiences. What's much more important is to understand, yeah, you do change based on your experiences, and those changes aren't things you can just then dump at the moment of death and say, oh, well, I'm a terrible person, bye-bye, see y'all. No, you get to be a terrible person into the next life and suffer all the consequences of being a terrible person. None of the buttons are working. In what way does the noting technique address the sila aspect of Buddhist practice? So I like this one. It's not a difficult one for me to answer, but this is someone who I think has good question. So the noting technique, we would theorize or explain, teach that the noting technique involves sila, samadhi, and panya, so morality, concentration, and wisdom. Because, you see, in Buddhism, we're very concerned or very careful about our words and about precision in the things we say and in the words we use. So when you say morality, I mean, it's such a vague word, right? That in Buddhism we say, no, what really is morality? And we'd say, morality is a quality of a moment of experience. It can't be anything else or else it doesn't really exist. So morality we use to describe moments of experience that are not conducive for the arising of defilements, that are not conducive for, well, ultimately doing and saying bad things. So real morality is when you guard your mind. It's a guarded state of mindfulness, really. Or there's many ways, but most effectively through mindfulness. Because when you're mindful, when you say to yourself, seeing, It's a guarding process. Morality is really the meditation practice. It's where you are moral. Because the implication of not being mindful is that if something that makes you angry comes up, you're going to get angry. If you're going to get angry, you're going to be immoral, act immoral. So yes, on the one hand, we could say morality is not killing, not stealing, it's ethical behavior of body and speech. That's one Buddhist way of explaining it. But on an ultimate level, morality is the state of these moments of mind that are in a way, or arising in a way that isn't going to lead to bad speech or bad action. Isn't going to lead you to try to hurt other people or manipulate others or so on. So in that way, the noting addresses the sila aspect directly. You can see that in the fact that it leads to concentration, because the problem with unethical behavior is it's a leaving behind of reality in favor of your wants and your likes and so on. It's based on delusion. You would never kill someone or steal something if you were clearly aware of things. So when you're mindful, you could never do those things. As a result, it leads to focus. You're no longer distracted or disturbed by bad deeds or bad intentions. And as a result, there arises wisdom. Once you're focused, once you have samadhi, which is focus, things come into focus, then there arises understanding. Oh, look at this habit. That's really not good for me. Oh, this habit is good. This leads to peace and happiness. And your mind starts to change based on that wisdom, that understanding. So sila, samadhi, panya, they arise in the meditation practice like that. Okay, this one is good. There's really good questions in here, but I would really rather... The problem with a person who asks lots of questions is you get a sense that their mind is not very focused. Their mind is not very still. And so, in some sense, you want them to calm down before you start answering their questions. Because if it appears that all their mind is engaged in is questioning, and what good is it going to do if I answer for a person whose mind is all up in the air? What happens is they ask more questions. They think about what you answer and they puzzle it out, and at best they just go away and leave you alone, but at worst they start to ask more and more questions. I'm not saying it's good that they leave you alone, I'm saying it's just less of a headache, but it'd be much better if they were to note doubting. Remember about questions. Good way of solving all your questions, just say doubting, or confused. And a lot of your questions will just disappear. But I'll go through these, I'll see which ones are actually, because they're pretty good questions. It's not that the questions are wrong, it's just I'm not keen on answering lots and lots of questions because of that. I've actually cut people off before. You're cut off. No more questions for you. Not forever, but too many questions. I say, you have to go and meditate. I want to see fewer questions from you. Okay, I don't understand the first part, so I'm just going to skip it. Oh no, I right, it leads into the next part. I want to go all the way. What should I do? Come to the monastery? No, you can meditate at home. I mean, of course, if you come to the monastery, it'd be much easier, it'd be much better to progress. You say you're gaining progress, so just keep that up. If you want real, intense progress, come and stay with us, or find a place to dedicate yourself to the practice. What are the common mistakes in meditation? Didn't we have this question recently? I did have it recently, I think. What is the most common mistake? Maybe I deleted it. I may have deleted it. I think it's problematic because I don't really have a sense of... I mean, what kind of a question is it to say what are the most common mistakes? Why? I mean, the question I ask is, why is that important for you to get an answer on that? So then we can figure out what's the problem. Because You're concerned that you might be practicing wrong. You're concerned that you might be making mistakes. And that really shouldn't be a concern if you've read my booklet and really understood it, because what's happening there is there's a rising doubt. Am I doing it right? And then as a teacher I think, well, are you doing it or not doing it? There's not really much to it. But you see what happens when you start to practice. Doubt arises. And that's a part of the practice. It's valid. But the answer, the response should be to say doubting, doubting. Because you'll never come up with an answer. You can't just sit there and say, am I doing it right? And hope for suddenly, oh, yes, I'm doing it right. Doubt, especially because doubt is habit forming. The more you doubt, the more you're liable to doubt. So rather than answer what are the most common mistakes in meditation, it's like, study how to meditate or find a teacher and practice it. And when you have doubt, just say to yourself, doubting, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? Because mostly that's just your mind's lack of strength, the weakness of the mind. The mind is weak and fickle, so flitting here and there and indulging in old habits of doubt. When I'm not strong, fall into doubt, and then it's a very strong emotion, so you get caught up on it. Okay, many different things. Noting what's the order, what should we focus on? So we say to focus on the breath because it's a good, or not the breath, but the stomach rising and falling. It's a good object to always come back to. But then just note whatever else comes, one thing, note it, and when it's gone, come back to the breath. If during your daily life, much less organized, I would say, just whatever you can, be mindful whenever you remember it. Note whatever comes. Do we need to say exactly what we are doing at the right time? It's not magic, like somehow if you do, you're going to unlock some secret door that gets you to enlightenment. It's just good for you. So take it more as organic. You don't have to this way, that way, or however. Use it as a tool to learn more about how your mind works, what's going on right now, to keep yourself present. Okay, here's a question about non-self. So we have this phrase from the Sabbasava Sutta, Nati me atati, va asa sachato te tato ditti upajati. So the view arises that this is right, this is true, that myself doesn't exist. Nati meyata means myself is not. And so the question is, wait, is that wrong view? Because the Buddha seems to be saying that it's wrong view. He doesn't say wrong view with any of this. He says these are views, and that's the problem. I mean, what does it mean to say myself doesn't exist? The premise is already wrong. The framework, you're starting with, it's like saying, we have this microphone. Let's talk about this microphone. Does this microphone exist? Does this? As soon as you start that, you've already set a base of the microphone. So the same with myself. Myself, does it exist? Does it not exist? As soon as you say myself doesn't exist, you're engaging in a framework. Why that framework is wrong is because it has nothing to do with experience. Myself has no relevance in experience. Experience is seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, thinking. As soon as the problem is we have this overarching sense of self, and we've built it up lifetime after lifetime, so we don't stay with experience. We get into, this is me moving, this is me talking, this is me hearing, this is me seeing. But those are all just thoughts, and again, thoughts are experience. Anytime these other things come, they're all just ditti, they're views, and they're getting you off track. There's no benefit to saying nati meyata. It's quite a detriment, actually, because you're lost in intellectual thought. Is it true you can get enlightened by certain chanting and reflection of oneness? Survey says no. And that's all for tonight. So probably there are more questions, actually. Probably people are still asking questions. But unfortunately, No, I mean, it's not working, the interface, so it's not working for us, it's probably not working for anybody. Dare I go and check, refresh the page? Maybe it's working now. Oh yes, it's working now. Oh wait, this one was here. Why didn't I read that one? Right, because this is one we were talking about. Wouldn't it be much more maintainable throughout the day to just be aware of experiences without the constant noting? Much more maintainable. By that you probably mean easier, right? Or you may not have wanted to say that, but I would criticize or critique what you're saying by saying, doesn't that just mean easier? You say it's, a whole day of talking to myself seems pretty tiring. So you want to expend less energy. I mean, I'm putting words in your mouth and I'm rephrasing it in a less charitable way. But that's the argument I'd put back at you. If you want easy, there are lots of things to do that are easy. So that's not necessarily a sign that it's good. And as far as not expending so much energy, we're actually interested in cultivating energy, in working out. It's like a mental workout in many ways. We want our minds to be sharper, to be stronger. And that's going to take some work. So yes, the meditation is artificial. Just like weights are artificial. You go and you sit on this weight bench and you pump weights. It's artificial. But what's the result? The result is a stronger body. Meditation, the noting, is artificial, no question. All meditation, really in a sense, is an artificial activity designed to strengthen the mind in some way, or train the mind, or do something to the mind. For us, it's to strengthen the mind's clarity, to be able to see things as they are. So the noting is indispensable for that. I mean, could you gain insight without it? Probably. Would it be as powerful? I don't think it would be as powerful. I've answered this question a lot, so I was almost going to delete it, but Edit said, it really reminded me that you have to answer again and again the same question. This one we're done. This one we're done. Deleting all, I've answered those, so we're good. Uh-oh, another long one. Starting with the phrase, I am a physicalist. I don't prefer the term over materialist. Someone called me out. I used to use materialist, but someone said, no, that's not really, so not to be pedantic, but I'm just following what they said. I simply don't see any objective evidence to claim that the mind is non-material. Wow. Huh. I don't know what to say. I mean, what is material? What is material? If it's not non-material, then I assume you have some evidence to say that it's material, right? Because you say there's no evidence to say that the mind is not material, right? But there's no evidence to say that the mind is not a duck, right? That the mind is not a platypus. You have no evidence that the mind is not a platypus, right? Is basically what you're saying. So so then I would say, wait a minute. It's not the mind. You have no evidence to say that the mind is not a teapot, right? Russell's teapot. It's not a teapot orbiting the earth, orbiting the sun, or whatever. Of course, we have no evidence, but we're not required to provide evidence that it's not something. Which I think you've caught yourself in, which is, you have to be careful there. It sounds like you're a scientist. I don't see an objective evidence to demonstrate the claim that the mind is non-material. We don't have to prove that. You have to prove that you have to provide evidence that the mind is material, which is called the hard problem. And it's the hard problem. Google it. Philosophy, and people debate it, and of course materialists, physicalists, they find ways to logically argue themselves in circles until they convince themselves that it's physical, but It's the hard problem, because the mind is not physical. I mean, there's no connection. The question is, real question is, what is physical? We don't really know. Quantum fields? Strings? Who knows? It's not atoms. It's not even subatomic particles. What's an electron, right? Is it a wave? Is it a particle? Lots of theories. But it's absurd, really, because what's going on when that happens? When you talk about, when I just talked about all that, what was really happening was, I point to my head, but was thoughts, which are experience, which are immaterial. I mean, there's nothing material there, there's just an experience. Maybe it's misleading to say material, non-material. There's experience, we know that. That's what Descartes saw, and he was very wise to see that. I mean, he wasn't the first one. Obviously, in India, the Buddha was far, far beyond Descartes, but if you want a modern example that the Westerners look up to, cogito ergo sum, cogito, it's the thinking, that's the ultimate base of reality, and he was right. The experience. So then, if that's the basis, then your argument and any arguments about physicalism or materialism are really hard to maintain, because they're dependent on that experience. You know the brain in the vat thought experiment. How do we, and that's where the Matrix came from, this movie in the 90s. How do we know we're not just in some virtual reality world? We can't know that we're not. We can't know that we're sitting here. Because I could postulate a thought experiment of some complex, advanced, virtual reality thing that was feeding us this stimuli to make us think that this is where we were. And that thought experiment points out the fact that there's very little we can know, if anything, beyond experience. Everything else is just conjecture based on noting or making note of observations. Gravity. We think that there's such a thing as gravity, that when you drop something, it's going to fall. How do we know that the next time I drop something, it's going to not go up? We don't know. We don't know that gravity is not just God, some God playing tricks on us, and suddenly he's going to say, okay, no more gravity. I may be going too far with all of that. There may be some... Anyway, I don't want... it's not my intention to go that far. It's my intention to poke holes in the certainty of science, the certainty of physical science, physics, and so on. Because I think the people who are really keen on it, and scientists who are really working in science, will agree with at least some of what I say, when they say, look, that's not... we don't make such claims that the mind is physical. What do? We work with machines and we conduct experiments and we come up with results, and we, based on those observations, we do useful things. I've talked to scientists, physicists, doing their PhDs and stuff, and say, this is what we do. We do these experiments, we come up with results, and they're useful. Some people have these theories about reality. The Buddha didn't go for it. He was much more of a guy doing experiments, saying, look, if you do this, this is the result, and it's useful. The Buddha was another one of these scientists who did something practical. And moreover, more importantly, he saw that that's reality, that's truth. Truth is not found in making theories about, is the mind material, is the mind immaterial. That's just rubbish. Not useful. Oh, here he goes on. This is interesting. So, I mean, certainly I'm not going to convince everyone with these arguments. The other part is the claim that reincarnation is true, so I've just talked about that. We don't believe in reincarnation. We just have the sense that you'd have to provide evidence based on this experience continuing through observation. You'd have to provide evidence that somehow that stops at the moment of death. You're the one that is required to provide evidence, because you claim that at the moment of some abstract conception of death that we see in other people but never don't have any memory or experience of having it happen to us firsthand, that by that somehow the mind just stops. doesn't appear to be backed by evidence or observation. So then he says, you seem to be very intelligent, and I'm surprised you seem to cling to the worldview of some kind of dualism as opposed to just accepting that consciousness is simply our brains processing reality. Yikes. How do we unpack this? Some kind of dualism. I don't see what the problem with dualism is. If there's one thing, why can't there be two? Science likes to find the one theory of everything. What would that prove? You'd still have to figure out, why is this theory the truth, right? We still don't have an answer for that. Buddhism doesn't provide an answer like science is seeking for. Why the heck are things the way they are, right? What's the deal with the universe? That kind of thinking comes from, theistic background, really. It's sort of, it's what implicates or implies the existence of a higher being that created the world, even if it's as a backlash to that, a reaction to that. If you react and say, no, there's no, and we're going to find out the true meaning, you're still barking up the wrong tree. The universe is kind of like I would say reality is like a balloon. The further you go out, it stretches. And you have to put more force and more force in. So you're thinking more and more complicated. But all you're doing is stretching. Cling to the worldview of dualism. So that doesn't seem like a valid criticism. Not that I think I do cling to any kind of dualism. As I said, I think experience pretty much sums up reality. It's much more complicated than that, but the complications just show variation of experience. Brains aren't something that exists in my mind. A brain is an abstract concept. Now, the thing we use to call a brain, we can see it actually affects the working of the mind. You can cut out part of the brain, experience changes quite drastically. But if you kill the brain, the experience will change, will switch. That's what we call death, when the brain is no longer alive. That's not because the brain creates experience, it's because we've spent how many years, like we start with 9 months in the womb, obsessing over this thing and identifying with it based on all of our past defilements and delusions. And throughout our life we reaffirm our connection with the brain. Like, this is it, this is who I am, yes, my arms. And it becomes more and more convoluted and complicated as we live our lives. It's like a prison, really. Such that we really are at a loss. We're not equipped to deal with the loss of part of the brain, which is why there's a strong change of experience. Anyway, I don't want to offer this up as evidence because I think it's misleading. I don't feel the need to offer evidence. There's no question in my mind, and it seems quite obvious, and unfortunately we've just been so spun out of control with our physicalist views. But reality is experience. Experience is real. Read some philosophy. Not all philosophy. Read Descartes. Maybe that's not a good advice. I'm not that fond of Descartes. I just like what he said there about that. Just accepting that consciousness is simply our brains processing reality. What the heck does that even mean? Do you know what a brain is? A brain is neurons firing. It's cells. What are you talking about? The brain process? Brains don't process anything. Brains are just cells made up of subatomic particles firing. It's like a complex pinball machine. I mean, how could that be processing anything? There's a really interesting, not Buddhist, and I kind of lost interest after a while, but I can't remember. He's a fairly famous philosopher. And he was talking about this idea of information. We say information being processed by the brain, and it's just absurd, because information is only a meaningful term when you're dealing with a person processing, a person conscious of the information. This computer has no information in it. It's information only to a person, only to a sentient being. only to a consciousness that can process it. So the brain is just a complex, computer. There's no way you could possibly explain it as anything else. Now, I've talked to people who tried. One example goes way back to Socrates, or Plato, who brought up the argument whether the mind is just like resonance. So you have a banjo, and you play the banjo. It wasn't a banjo, it was some other instrument. And suddenly there's this sound. Ooh, where did that sound come from? And they say, consciousness is just like that. It's a emergent property or something like that. The funny thing about emergent properties like smoothness, right? So this is not smooth. But when you put it together in the right way, poof, smoothness arises. So why couldn't the brain be like smoothness or whatever? But the funny thing is that it's only smooth to the mind, to the person. It's not smooth in any other sense of the word. Hot. Something is only hot to the mind, to the experiencer. I don't want to get too much into it. I mean, hey, if you really think I'm off the wall crazy, by all means, I'm not looking for more students. Let's move on. There's more here, though. It's quite interesting. I don't see how any personal evidence you have from meditation couldn't easily be a hallucination of some sort. Aha! But then I turn the tables on you and say, how do we know this all isn't a hallucination? And that's where Descartes was brilliant. He really got it. How did he get it? Because he sat down and meditated. He looked at his experience. He said the same thing that you're saying now. How do we know it's not all a hallucination? And he said, how do I know, for example, I'm not being tricked that I'm seeing this computer, or this candle? He said this candle, right? He's looking at the candle. And he said, but wait a minute. Could I be tricked into thinking that I'm thinking? And he said, no. Could I be tricked into thinking that I'm experiencing and not really be experiencing? Wait a minute, that's not possible. It's not possible to be tricked into thinking you're experiencing, because you have to experience to think. Right? Make sense? Mm-hmm. So there's one thing that you can be sure of, and that's experience. Now, you elaborate that and you say, okay, but what about all those things you experience? We're only concerned with understanding experience, much in the same way as a scientist would. So, if I see that this experience is followed by that experience, what the result of that, of seeing that, now this experience leads to that experience, and that experience is unpleasant, or is not what I was aiming for. The result of that is that your experience will change. You will see. The result of that is that those experiences are diminished, because the mind places less emphasis on them. The mind is less excited about them. And through the lack of excitement, you'll see results. So it's just another scientist doing experiments and getting results and saying, hey, this works. It's not even really a question of, what if tomorrow it doesn't work? Because it's working now. Right? It's like gravity. What if gravity just stopped working? What if meditation just stopped working? I can't say that it's not. Somehow the mind is suddenly going to work in a different way. You could hypothesize that might happen. It doesn't really matter, because I'm doing this and it's having the result. The scientists will say the same thing. Doesn't matter if gravity stops working. It's working now. As long as it's working, this is a useful experiment. It allows us to build rockets and stuff. If gravity changed, well, then we'll figure out new experiments and new rockets and whatever. So that criticism also not really valid, not really bothered by it. At the very least, why don't we just admit? I understand that these are good questions, and being critical like this is important. It's important that you don't just accept things blindly, to an extent. At the very least, why don't we just admit that we currently don't know what consciousness is or whether reincarnation is true? Yeah, okay, so you want to be hard on me and then say, look, why do we have to be so sure about these things? I hope that some people have heard what I've said and said, okay, I kind of get where he's coming from and it's all good. But I'm not suggesting a definition of consciousness. I'm just saying consciousness exists. I don't have to say anything else, because you're the one that's trying to say, you, or not you, but people like the people who present questions like you're presenting are the ones who have to find some way to connect it with the brain. And not connect it, because I agree that it's connected with what we call the brain, but to say that it's actually physical, which is really, it's not a hard problem, it's impossible. It's just a silly exercise. It's a wild goose chase. Of course, not everyone agrees with me, but you've asked me, so. Reincarnation is true, so again, your challenge is to provide me with evidence, compelling evidence, that the mind ceases to exist, ceases to continue at the moment of death. There's some interesting evidence in that regard in terms of near-death experiences, where the brain is totally dead, and there's no measurable brain activity. And then the mind comes back, and was able to remember experiences, that had experiences during the time that the brain was dead. It's not conclusive. I don't really want to go there, but it's interesting to talk about, because it's not even a question of, maybe there was some brain activity that we couldn't measure. Actual thought is accompanied by intense brain activity, and any theory of the brain creating consciousness requires complicated and highly measurable brain activity. And they say that's just not there during this time. The mind is doing something else, totally unrelated to the brain. I mean, there's not proof, and people criticize and argue against this, but interesting anyway, I think. I think admitting ignorance is the best action in this case. Well, I hope you're a little bit clear about why I disagree with you, in some sense. Yes, I think ignorance is the best action in many cases, admitting ignorance, rather than being too sure of yourself. But I think you are guilty of that in some regards as well. Instead of being ignorant, you're saying, admitting ignorance, or not being ignorant, admitting ignorance. You're saying, why don't we just admit that it's the brain? Well, why would we admit such a thing? We need evidence. Okay, last question. How do I raise my self-esteem? I feel like most of my life is affected by what I think of myself. People have told me I am smart, but I can't advance in math or any other subject without getting sad or frustrated. Deal with the sadness and frustration. Forget about the self-esteem. You're worthless. We're all worthless. We have no worth. You have no worth. Anyone who told you otherwise was wrong. But that makes you free, because what does it mean to have worth? Maybe it's really the wrong... I don't know if that's such a fair thing to say. People don't like it when I say that. I understand. Meaningless, purposeless, We don't have any worth. We're worthless, because worth is just an arbitrary measure. Someone says you're smart. What does that mean? Someone says you're stupid. What does that mean? They're comparing you to someone else. Why is that? We have to question so many of our presumptions. That's what philosophers do in many cases. They just question people's assumptions. We have so many assumptions that somehow my comparison with someone else is meaningful. Yeah, I got 90 on my test. Someone else got 95. What does that mean? I failed my test. What does that mean? I practiced meditation and became an arahant. I practiced meditation and I didn't get anywhere. What does that mean? None of it means anything. There's no meaning. All we can say about life is there are certain things that are consistent. In other words, I want this as the result, and I get this as the result. And other things that are inconsistent. I want this as a result, and it's not the result of what I'm doing. And if you're mindful, if you're observant and actually learn about reality, you become more consistent, which really translates into happiness and peace, because you stop doing things that make you unhappy. Saying, this will make me happy, and it makes you unhappy. That's really the essence of mindfulness. So getting sad and frustrated, you have to look at your situation and saying, what of my situation is creating me sadness and frustration? Or what of my experience is creating suffering? What of my experience is creating happiness? And the sadness and the frustration are creating suffering for you. So they're really what you have to address. Not that you're smart or stupid or hate yourself. Well, no, that you hate yourself. The reactions you have. Not that you are useless or worse than other people. Don't compare well to other people. Not that you can't advance in math. I guarantee you that's not something important. It's useful. If you advance in math, you might get more money and get a better job, make more money. But it's not important with a capital I. Important is consistency, really. Doing things that make you happy. You want to be happy, and yet you get sad and frustrated. What good is that? That doesn't advance your goal to be happy. So you have to work on that. Don't get sad or frustrated. How do you do that? Well, be more mindful, study it, examine these emotions, and your mind will become less interested in them and become more peaceful. Oh, more and more questions. That's not fair. I can't answer them fast enough. I'm cutting it off. These new questions have to wait till next week. I'm the tyrant. I'm in charge here. I can't delete questions. I'm not going to delete the new ones. They'll stay till next week. But you're not sneaking new ones in. That's not fair. Now it's not loading. Time is it? 45 minutes? That's plenty of time. That's all for tonight. Thank you all for tuning in. Wish you all a good night.